Alrighty, we're going to begin chapter 11, is it? I think it's chapter 11. Okay, let's hope so. And this week's all about what we call financial statement fraud. Or management fraud. They are one and the same, interchangeable in definition. Management fraud is a fraud not where they are embezzling assets from the company. That we learned can happen at the lower rank employee level or the higher rank employee level. That's embezzlement. That is occupational fraud. This is financial statement fraud or management fraud is something that is done by the management of the company, generally speaking, because they're the ones in charge of the financial statement. As a quick review, what we did look at one point in time is we looked at the fact that there is an animal called the financial statements of a company, and those financial statements reflect the income and the financial position of a company. So there are two things that are part and parcel, or these are the two components. There's a few other components, but these are the main ones that Wall Street, your New York Stock Exchange, your Standard & Poor's, your NASDAQ, they read these financial statements of companies that publish them, and public companies are required to publish them. So it's probably a good thing to know that public companies, all of their statements are, like it says, public. They are published, and you can find those at the website called edgar.gov, which is maintained by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The Securities and Exchange Commission has oversight of these financial statements, and this is probably a good time to explain what the Securities and Exchange Commission is all about before we get back to what will ostensibly be what you dreaded might happen in this class. Oh yeah, many of you said, I hope he's not going to do accounting. And yes, we're going to do a little bit, not too bad. I do a little accounting lesson. But before we get into the accounting lesson, what we are talking about is the fact that companies, public companies and private companies as well, but public companies where their statements are published and their stocks are sold on the New York Stock Exchange. So these statements are read by the public, read by Wall Street business analysts, read by investors, read by creditors of companies, read by the shareholders of the companies. And by reading these statements, they can get a relative glimpse, a relative measurement of how the company is doing. And that measurement is mathematical because these are numbers like you would expect. They are accounting statements. And they're supposed to tell a true, accurate, and fair story. That's the word on the street. These are supposed to fairly represent, or we could just say, like the accountants call it, fairly present. Fairly present. And there's two things that they fairly present, so let's see what they are. So the financial statements are supposed to fairly present. We are going to get some accounting here. I'm afraid you need to know it for these couple of chapters. So they fairly present, one, the results of operations, and that means, did I make money? Did I lose money? Results of operations. Many people refer to this as the income statement, which it is. And the other aspect that is supposed to fairly present would be what we call the statement financial position or balance sheet. So we'll call it financial position, meaning where is your financial position? Are you strong? Do you have lots of cash? Are you able to pay your bills? So these are the two main components that are supposed to be fairly presented in publicly held companies. And what outside auditors do is outside auditors are peeking in, kicking the tires of both of these, and then opining. It's a good word. That means they're making an opinion. They're opining on, do these indeed fairly present these two items? If they do, then they give them a nice grade, like A+. Well, they don't actually grade. They just say they do fairly present the results of operations and the financial position of the company at certain dates, whatever the dates are that's presented. If they do not, then the auditor has to disclose what the problems are, at least to a certain extent. If the problems are large enough, they'll just simply say these do not fairly present the results of operation and financial position of the company at such and such a date. Or they might say, well, they do present fairly, except in certain circumstances they don't. And that's what's known as, there's different opinions that can be written. We'll just talk about a few. So first opinion is just we'll call it a clean opinion, meaning a clean opinion would say they do present fairly the results of operations and financial position. A second concept would be what's called a not negative opinion. We'll call it a adverse opinion, and it's sort of like a negative opinion because it will say they don't fairly present the results of operation or financial position. Then there's a third one. We're going to learn all four of them here today. Oh boy, we're going to make you auditors and accountants. Next thing you know, you'll be taking your CPA exam. And this third opinion is what's known as a disclaimer. Disclaimer is we couldn't do enough work to come up with an opinion, so it's we would say, I was going to use the word don't again, but that would be misleading to the adverse opinion. So this would be no opinion was able to be rendered. That's what a disclaimer means. Couldn't do it. So this would be a couldn't. The other one is don't. They don't represent. This is don't represent fairly. So put RF, represent fairly. Here we couldn't come up with an opinion. That is the third type of opinion. And the fourth opinion is what's known as a limited scope opinion. Or another way to say it, you wouldn't say it if you were in the Smith School. If you're walking the halls of the Smith School and you would just say partial opinion, people would throw you out of the building. But that's really what a limited scope is. It's a partial opinion. Limited scope could say something like, except for blah, 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 blah. Except for blah, 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 it does present fairly, PF. It does present fairly. So limited scope is the fourth type, where it just basically says, yeah, it's halfway there. Which half? They'll tell you. They'll write it in the opinion which half is good and which half isn't bad. So again, the four types is a clean opinion, which basically says everything's good. And then one's called an adverse, which means there is an opinion, but these do not present fairly. I think I have to change this to a PF. Doesn't present fairly the results of operations. Disclaimer: we couldn't get to an opinion. We were unable to draw an opinion. We didn't have it. Usually it means because we just couldn't test enough, or there wasn't enough good evidence. There could be a variety of reasons why there's a disclaimer. Could be that management decided not to let us in the building. and we were engaged here. This is an unusual situation. Let's talk about an auditing firm that was engaged to audit a major New York Stock Exchange company, and maybe there was a falling out between the board of directors and the managers and the auditors that were hired, where they didn't want them to do the audit, but the auditor said, we were engaged, we have a contract, so we're coming in to do it, and so they just won't let them in the building. And absent some other type of legal agreement or understanding of how the CPAs should get out of their contract where they have to render an opinion. In other words, once you sign an engagement letter, sign a contract that you're going to render an opinion on a public company financial statement, you better do it unless you come to some understanding that will allow you to, quote, get out of the contract. Usually the board of directors will let you out if they don't want you to continue. But if you get into enough of a spat between each other, you got enough of a disagreement, then it could be that the auditors will be knocking on the door in this kind of situation, and management won't let them in. They'll say, we don't want you here. So the CPAs will say something like, well, let us out of the contract. We don't want you here. We're not talking to you. It could get like that. And so there'll be what's known as a disclaimer saying, because management wouldn't let us in the door, or they wouldn't let us see this, or they wouldn't let us do this, or they wouldn't, or because of things that management didn't even do badly, could be that the disclaimer is, this is a company that operates in the Antarctica. Let's do it like that. This is a company that does all their operations in Antarctica because of the melting snow and the heat, whatever. I'm not making it up, unfortunately, but because of the melting South Pole, one of the icebergs broke off from the land. And that's what had everything was there that we needed to audit, so we couldn't get there to audit it. So we can't render an opinion. We don't render an opinion. No opinion. That's not the same as this. This is an opinion which says these statements do not represent fairly or present the results of operation or the financial statement, or financial position. So then we've got limited scope, which is we couldn't get to everything to look at, or we had certain limitations in the ability to do an audit, not necessarily management fault, could be, but whatever it is, we could still render some opinion. We could say that most of the statement's good, but we can't tell you about this particular aspect of the statement. So limited scope is almost like a disclaimer, but much more still allowing the auditor to say something good about the statement, where with a disclaimer, they can't say anything bad, but they can't say anything at all because they don't know enough. So disclaimer is where you just don't know enough to even begin to make an opinion. Limited scope is you've done enough work to say, except for these couple of items, it might just be one or a couple of items, the statements are pretty good. All right, and that's in the nature of what's called an except for. Everything else, everything is presented fairly. Okay, so obviously, hold on a second. That's what I'm holding on. Pardon me. It's a good thing we're not in a classroom. Okay. Obviously, this is where you want to be. You want to get a clean opinion if you are the board of directors and management of a company, and you have to get audited, by the way. We're going to talk about that. You have to get audited, so you want to be there. You don't want to ever have this. That doesn't look good at all, because if it's an adverse opinion, usually means things are pretty bad. Disclaimer, this again, depending on the circumstances, could be here. This is a great year for a disclaimer opinion, perhaps. We couldn't get there because the company couldn't open their doors due to the virus, due to the pandemic. So we couldn't kick the tires and count the inventory. We don't know. But it's not bad. It's just we couldn't do any testing. This is more likely what would happen in the pandemic year, where we did many of our audit procedures, but a couple of them we couldn't get to. So we're telling you that the statements by and large are good, except for whatever issues we couldn't do. All right, that's enough for now. See you on the flip side.